introduce Associate Professor Gavin Smith from the ANU. His specialty is the study of surveillance. He is a sociologist and a criminologist, and he's very well qualified to talk about the current interest in the federal government's coronavirus app, and it's unfolding as we speak. And so thanks, Gavin. And what are your initial thoughts about this app that's about to be set upon us?
Thanks, Roger, and it's great to speak with you and great to be in this kind of forum. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a tricky question because I think it's one of these classic moments where the technology, in a sense, and the policy is ahead of the actual public knowledge of what's going on. It seems to me quite improvised, and that like every day we're being drip fed another bit of detail about who's got the contracts. Is it going to be Amazon overseas in the United States? Who's designing, who's making the actual technology? Will the private sector have any kind of leverage over the data that's being generated? And yeah, I think there's just a lot of this stage. It's quite early, and it's just hard to get that accountability and get that clarity of what the purpose and function of this app is going to be, aside from its very superficial function of being able to monitor which members of the public are in close proximity to each other, and then obviously this telephone exchange that's supposed to be encrypted on each other's phone. But I think, yeah, my sense is that this is, not necessarily something spectacularly new. The fact that it's happening on a smartphone device, is just so familiar to so many people that so many apps on our phones are running in the background, taking down our location, taking down our sharing practices. So we're all very kind of familiar and already deeply embedded within surveillance culture. So in some ways, although this is in the moment of crisis and that kind of unfolding event of COVID-19 and all the hysteria and panic and concern, and a lot of it very justified around that impending risk, I think we've seen a lot of things in a sense like this before, albeit in slightly different contexts and certainly different temporalities compared to this kind of very extreme event we're seeing.
And an initial understanding would always sort of inspire one to think of George Orwell, but one of the problems for many of us is that we graciously give our own data across to all the social media and to businesses and so forth. And how would you understand that sort of dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think this is kind of slightly nuanced and different. Very interesting is this kind of public health dimension to it. This kind of the virus being the object here, and the attempt for this kind of technological kind of gadgetry to try and map and control and record and inform different health authorities to be able to deal with this. So I think in the context that you've raised, I completely agree. People, and I've already written a paper about this called Data Doxa, which kind of draws on some of Borges' ideas. People have become so habituated into revealing themselves in different manifestations, in different kinds of containers and contexts. And so, in that paper actually was very much pointing to this sense of us becoming utterly familiar with, utterly kind of coalescent with this kind of constant performativity of the self, sharing of, fragments of interiority in all these different kinds of systems. And for lots of reasons, organizational reasons, in fact, we are, forced to share lots of personal information to be able to access resources, access social spaces, but also importantly, that kind of desire to present a stylized version of the self to different audiences we're trying to enthrall and enchant and get their attention on us. So in that sense, it's a very receptive environment when you've got that habitus already there. that has been, built over those last 20 years or so with all these different digital devices and the Internet of Things, it's suffusing our lives. But then you throw in this crisis, this mega event, this intensity, and put those things together. And no doubt you will get an awful lot of people who, think this is a really good idea and have no problems at all with it. And you'll still get those others because of this sense of the health data belonging to us, very much something of interiority, something we don't want to share with a kind of a public audience. So there might be some resistance there. I suspect there will be some micro. Well, so it's a fascinating case study for sociologists to be looking at. Absolutely.
And in another sense too, it's as many of the medical specialists suggest, this is first and foremost an epidemiological issue, and it's one that can be managed because we're not going to get a vaccine, certainly in the short term, if ever. It is one where data which could be produced by smartphones and so forth could help us very much. But I wonder, even if the app was, despite all the issues of surveillance and privacy, I wonder if the app would be up to scratch in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, Roger, and it's one of these things that it's tricky, isn't it? Because we are always kind of on the outside, on the margin of the machineries of production, of how these things are being melded and made and produced and sold in those kinds of very kind of securitized containers, those black boxes as they've been termed. It's difficult to know how it's being developed, with what kinds of logics and rationalities and interests. And what really does concern me is the fact that it takes a mega event like COVID-19 for this kind of sudden rush to assemble this kind of entity, where there's very little opportunity for public accountability for all the reasons I've already said. The fact that, people that are really interested in this, experts in this kind of area of looking at the social and cultural implications of these kinds of technologies, are playing catch up all the time with the designers, with the policymakers. We're not sitting in those kinds of laboratories advising, overseeing, what's going on. It's this kind of very rapid rush to grab this kind of technological salvation and implement it and just plug people into it. And I guess, yeah, it's really frustrating and bewildering to me why it takes this kind of a mega event for this to kind of happen in such a rushed fashion, ad hoc fashion, improvised fashion, where there's not those kinds of lines of accountability and deliberation space sort of opened up for experts to be involved in ensuring that what is being made, what is being sold, is actually fit for purpose and is going to operate in ethically sound ways. And clearly technically sound ways, because of course, as we know as sociologists, any piece of technology, any gadgetry, always has unintended consequences as it permeates the complexity of social relations. And yeah, there's all sorts of questions around this about people, not having smartphones, for lots of different reasons, economic reasons, reasons of age, socioeconomic status, whatever, social position broadly. And also, the fact it being an opt-in thing, and all these kind of interesting figures being banded around. We need 40%, not 35, not 50, 40, without really clear justification, explanation as to why those kinds of figures. And one thing I think is very, very interesting, and this comes beautifully out of the surveillance studies literature, is the opportunistic moment of an event like this, where everyone is feeling very anxious, everyone is subject to these extraordinary restrictions. And what I think is very interesting in the selling of this piece of technology is this kind of moralization that if you buy into this now, we will end these lockdown measures quicker. And so it's this kind of, classic moralization of the individual, that it's your responsibility for the public good to do this.
And it almost becomes like a consumer a consumer event, in a sense, that we're offering, we will transform you if you only buy this product. And of course, one of the issues is, as you say, we need this 40%, but we also need apparently a lot more for contact tracing. We need a lot more people to be tested. And at the moment, one of the aspects is that it doesn't seem like there's enough people being tested so that we can work on these probabilities and so forth.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's the thing, it just sort of takes the focus away from those kinds of, complex structural phenomena that are kind of operating in the background about, how well prepared are we in a neoliberalized age to have, mass population illness, and how well prepared are we with testing, how well prepared are we for hospital beds and ventilators. And it kind of puts that kind of utopian gaze onto a piece of technology as the kind of the salvation to this kind of thing. And that, look what we're doing this right now, we're manufacturing this is going to get us out of this situation quicker and get the economy up and running again. So I think it's that classic thing you see with any kind of technological solution that's presented, all the kinds of promises, the rhetorics under which it's kind of like, situated. And then, of course, all the mess behind that, all the obfuscation of actually knowing how this thing is going to work. And, particularly if it is going to go overseas where the data is held, that raises all sorts of, extra legal kinds of issues around, our data flowing from, this geography to another nation state sovereignty and their capacity potentially to be able to access that data. And not to mention, of course, all the concerns that people have about, security and these things being amenable to hacking. And we've seen, history's told us that any of these kinds of technological infrastructures will always have vulnerabilities. And so in no way am I saying, and I don't want to, present this, but no way am I saying this is not going to work. We're setting up for a failure. But I just want to point out, I think, some of the tendencies that we can see here that we've seen before, and it would be, it's important for us to just start to have these kinds of public conversations about them, so people are aware of how these things are working and how they sort of reify previous kinds of models and diagrams.
And of course, we're in a situation where, certainly in Australia, it seems the policy of isolation seems to have been working incredibly well, and now people seem to be a bit itchy and would love to get out, and yet all that could be undone. And I guess the promise is, oh well, if we get this app going, yes, you can leave the home, and yet there are concerns too that we might get a second spike in all this.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of interesting here too about the fact that the app's potentials in terms of its unfolding, and that what I mean by that is at this point, is it going to be the case that we see with this app that someone who is has had a lot of physical contact with others and it contracts COVID-19 coronavirus, is there a potential that they could be penalized at some point, that this kind of app, of course it's not being presented, I'm not in any way suggesting it's been presented by this sort of a benevolent state trying to look after its population, but I am just interested and curious about the fact that datafication of social relations flowing through that app in this kind of really extreme time where we're just seeing this massive transformation at every level of life, whether there could be a punitive dimension to it, that if could it be proven that you'd kind of deliberately weaponized your body and kind of infected the body politic at a level above a threshold, and therefore there's some kind of accountability. So I don't know, these are just things that are really important considerations when know about that sense of accountability and how it's going to be operated beyond the very reductionist, simplified kinds of statements we're getting from some of the ministers.
And yeah, that's correct. Well, I'd like to just start to wrap it up, and I guess we're in a situation where almost every week, it sets new records, and it's almost very difficult to remember back 7 or 8 days ago because things have changed so much, and we're at a situation where it looks like our other English-speaking countries, the United States and Great Britain, are certainly doing very badly compared to Australia. Do you have any last thoughts?
Well, I mean, as I say, in some ways, what the state has promised around this app, certainly from a surface level reading, it has definitely gone through some privacy hurdles, and I think that there has been a listening and attentiveness to the concerns of privacy advocates, not just privacy advocates, clearly socio-legal kinds of issues around, as I say, how that data may in the future be used for modelling, retrospective modelling, retrospective punishment, as I've indicated potentially. But yeah, I mean, I think as long as we are enabled to be part of the conversation and to ensure that there's lines of accountability, I think the fact that from what I understand, the app isn't going to register geolocation, which I think is very important. But I still would like to know a bit more about the details before I download it. But of course, I do understand also the context of fear and risk, and actual human suffering that we are very much witnessing. And I'm certainly not in any way averse to socio-technical solutions or platforms that we can try and manage this thing better. But I do think that it's the state's responsibility to be a bit clearer and a bit a bit more coherent in how they are presenting the rationality, the use, and the futurology of it. And I think sociology's got an important role to play in ensuring that we're having these conversations, the publics are being educated about these things, are having the opportunity to ask questions. And ideally we're trying to prepare these things in advance of these moments of crisis, so there's time to actually subject it to interrogation rather than the immediacy of a mega event and a crisis, and then just quickly, rapidly plugging us into these things. And I mean, I think, last thing I would definitely say too is the public trust needs to be built. It's really, really important. We have seen so many cases over the years of data leakage, data discrimination. I mean, there's books, brilliant sociological work being done on this, about how these things never operate equally. They never operate in objective and neutral ways, despite all the glib promises. And I think, there's a whole sense that I think the government's kind of missing to some degree, the fact that, there's a whole history of people seeing this, reading this, and trust needs to be built up before people can really, engage in these things. So I think that's something as well that's going to have to be worked out in the aftermath of COVID-19, is really trying to build up more public trust in how our political authorities are operating.